They tell you the exam is the hardest thing you will ever do. They say it in orientation, in the brochures, in the careful phrasing of the Academy's recruitment literature. They say it in the dismissive way of people who have said it many times and have stopped registering the gap between the words and the reality. 53 days aboard a decommissioned vessel. 10 candidates. No outside assistance unless you press the emergency locator and call in the rescue ship. All pass or all fail. No individual grades, no partial credit, no second chances for the cowards. They tell you this, and you nod and you think, I have come too far to fail. I have trained too long. I understand what is required. I was not ready. My name is Tados Lane. Most people who know me now call me Tada, though the junior cadets have recently taken something more formal that I choose not to repeat here. I was born on the Tiberius colony, an orphan raised in the state creche system, and I arrived at the Cosmo Academy's final examination with exactly one advantage over my 9 fellow candidates. I can tell when someone is lying. Not mind reading in the dramatic sense, the entertainment serials sell to children. I cannot hear your thoughts, cannot read your intentions like a page of text. What I have is something more subtle and considerably less reliable. Pressure at the base of my skull. Something between temperature and sound. A faint dissonance when the words coming at me do not match the belief behind them. It is involuntary, inexact, and cannot be turned off. It has saved my life on 3 occasions that I know of. During the exam, it very nearly got me killed. The morning of departure, the Academy staff loaded us into individual cryopods on the transfer shuttle and gave us each a sealed packet. Designation, ship assignment, team roster. I read mine in the shuttle's narrow corridor before the sedative hit. 10 names, 10 faces, 10 planetary origins scattered across 6 stellar nations and 2 independent systems. I memorized them the way I have always memorized things I know I will need. Not by forcing it, but by sitting with the information until it became familiar, until the names stopped being words and started being people I would recognize in a corridor at Threver. When the lights were bad, and I was half asleep. Teska, Sylvan Royal King Mayan from the planet Aritoskala, accustomed to command, afraid of failing, according to the creche counselors, who had taught me to read the specific texture of aristocratic anxiety. Knu, the non-human, Vidmanir Knum, from a world at the outer edge of the charted systems. Calm. Knu was calm in a way that went all the way down, no performance in it. Amazon Carnes, Terran commoner, from the rougher latitudes of our own system, built with a physical density that suggested whoever had done the building had planned for heavy use. Frol Baricheri Frol, from the unaligned planet Veen, and the file photo was inconclusive, and the file notes said almost nothing, and I had decided to withhold judgment entirely until I had been in the same room with them. Dolftata, navigator, from Paroma, a peacemaker by inclination, one of those rare people who genuinely finds the diplomatic path before reaching for the other kind. Chako Kaka, the medic, from the planet Q's, an opportunist according to some of her Academy evaluations, which usually meant she was good at finding the angle that worked in a room of people who had already stopped looking for one. Tony, small, quiet, empathic rather than telepathic, from Miss. Toto's gift ran in the other direction from mine, outward rather than inward. Glenn, broad-shouldered, rigid, one of Bacheska's planetary kin, carrying the specific stiffness of someone who has been told their whole life that strength is something you demonstrate rather than something you have. Marcus Soldum, the 4th child of his house, a Savan aristocrat by birth and temperament, who would side with Bacheska by reflex and make it look like principle. And me, 10 names. When the cryo-sleep wore off and I pulled myself up from the pod, blinking against the cold blue emergency lighting of the Esperanza's docking bay, I counted 11 people standing around me. I counted again, 11. Nobody said anything for a moment. We stood there in the recycled air of a ship that smelled of metal and something older. The particular staleness of a vessel that has been dark for a very long time. The smell of cold machinery in closed rooms, and the accumulated silence of years. And we counted, and counted again. Some people counted under their breath. Chaco counted with her eyes moving from face to face, with the systematic precision of someone cataloging specimens. Amazon counted with her arms crossed in the manner of someone who suspects the universe of making a mistake. and intends to document it. The number did not change. There has been an error, said Bacheska. He was the tallest man in the bay, broad-shouldered under his cadet's uniform, with the carriage of someone who had been told since birth that rooms arranged themselves around him. He said it with the absolute confidence of a man accustomed to errors being corrected the moment he identified them. Carried the trained presence of a person who has spent their whole life being listened to, and the authority of someone who genuinely believes that reality, when presented with his displeasure, will do the reasonable thing and adjust itself. No one corrected it. 11-1 extra. Somewhere in the pod bay behind one of those faces, someone was not supposed to be there. The Esperanza was old. Not old in the way of things that have been maintained and updated and kept functional through conscious attention. Old in the way of things that have simply endured, that have accumulated years like a ship accumulates micro-impacts. Patiently, layer by layer. Whatever her history, and she had one, you could feel it in the way certain corridors seemed to resist you, in the way panels that should have responded to standard academy credential returned error codes, in the way the air in the lower decks carried a faint mineral taste that no amount of cycling quite removed. She was functional enough. Lights came on in sections as we moved through her, ahead of us, and then behind us, as though the ship was deciding in real time how much illumination we deserved. The air cyclers ran with a low continuous sound that became so familiar with the first week that I only noticed it when it changed pitch. The bridge systems powered up with the slow, grudging deliberateness of machinery that has been waiting a long time to be used, and is not certain it wants to be. CNU ran system checks through the first day with the methodical patience of a large, very calm creature who did not waste words or gestures. Reported the basic systems as operational. Life support nominal. Drive systems offline but stable. Food synthesizers functioning at partial capacity. Enough for 10 people on rationed protocols, tight but manageable. Communication systems locked to Academy oversight mode, as designed. We could broadcast our status log, but we could not receive anything but emergency channels. And no one could reach us but the rescue ship. Navigation systems functional but read-only. We could see where the ship was, but we could not correct her course from the bridge alone. Drive reactivation would require work in engineering, and that would take time to assess. CNU did not, in his report, address the 11th person. None of us could. We searched the ship. Not once but 3 times. In different configurations, with different pairs checking each other's work. Counted ourselves repeatedly, formally in groups of 2 and 3 to prevent collusion in the counting. We reviewed the cryopod manifests from the transfer shuttle. 10 pods had been used. 10 transit records showed in the shuttle's flight log. The biosensor sweep of the ship's occupied spaces, run from the bridge terminal, registered 11 living bodies with the indifferent accuracy of hardware that does not take sides. We found no hidden compartments, no stowaways in the cargo holds, no one sleeping in a maintenance crawl space. Someone had come aboard without a record. Someone had slept in a pod without triggering the manifest. Someone with resources, or connections, or abilities that none of us could explain. We held the first full group meeting on the evening of day 1, in the mess hall, in the greenish functional light of a room that had been designed for utility and nothing else. A table bolted to the floor. Chairs that adjusted to different body configurations, with a reluctance that suggested they had not been adjusted in some time. Seska sat at the end, that the table's geometry implied was the head, without making a point of it, and laid out what we knew and what we needed to do. We would proceed with the examination as designed. We would maintain standard watch rotations with the addition of paired coverage wherever possible. We would document everything. We would not press the emergency locator unless the situation required it. Nobody mentioned that the situation had already produced something none of the Academy's documentation had prepared us for. Nobody mentioned that the phrase "the situation requires it" was considerably harder to define when the situation was already this strange. We were all, in our various ways, too committed to being people who did not press the button. I kept my mouth shut about what I could feel, because what I could feel, sitting in that mess hall on the first evening, was that every single person at that table believed they were telling the truth about who they were. Pressure at the base of my skull told me nothing. No dissonance, no concealment, no false note in the texture of anyone's self-presentation. Whoever was extra, they either did not know it themselves, or had a mental discipline that reduced my gift to uselessness. Neither possibility was comfortable to sit with. First meant the 11th person might be as confused as the rest of us. The second meant I was the least effective security system in the room. I ate my ration, I drank my water. I went on watch. The days that followed had a routine that would have been almost peaceful under different circumstances. Maintenance rotations every morning, assigned by Batseska, with the organizational instinct of someone who had been running logistics since childhood. Systems checks logged and signed off by Canoe. Navigation updates posted to the common board, as Dolph tracked the Esperanza's position relative to the black planet she was orbiting. A dead world. Airless. Its surface the color of old bruises, hanging below us with the patient gravity of a thing that has given up on most things, but retains the basic function of keeping objects in motion around it. Meals in the mess, twice daily on the ration schedule. Watch shifts on the bridge in pairs, 4 hours at a stretch. Physical training in the cargo bay, which Amazon ran with the cheerful brutality of someone who has never been in a situation she couldn't improve with more exercise. Learned each other by proximity. The way you always learn people when you are confined with them for long enough. Bass's command was effective and mostly fair, and only occasionally irritating, and the occasional irritations came specifically from the moments when he forgot that the group included people who had not grown up believing that his judgment was the natural conclusion of any reasonable discussion. Canoe said almost nothing for the first week, and then began gradually to contribute observations in brief sentences that were so precisely accurate that everyone stopped what they were doing to write them down. Dolph was easy to talk to, easy to work alongside, easy in the sense of someone who has decided not to make things harder than they have to be and has structured their entire personality around that decision. Chaco was sharp and watching and made observations about the group's dynamics that were accurate enough to be uncomfortable, delivered in a tone of pure clinical interest that made it unclear whether she was being perceptive or just honest. To-Ni was quietly present in every room, the kind of person whose empathic gift translated into an awareness of emotional weather that made them useful in tense situations and occasionally exhausting in comfortable ones. Frohl argued with everyone, not performatively, not to be difficult, or not only to be difficult. Frohl argued with the specific energy of someone who has spent their whole life being told what they can have, and has decided that the correct response to that situation is to dispute everything that can be disputed until they find the thing that cannot be taken away. The arguments were frequently right. The delivery was frequently abrasive. The combination created a particular dynamic in the mess hall, where the person making the most accurate point in the room was also the person everyone least wanted to agree with, because agreeing felt like rewarding behavior that made meals uncomfortable. I watched Frohl most carefully early on, not for the reasons the rest of the group did. The speculation about Frohl's biology and gender that ran through the group like a low current, surfacing in sideways glances and conversations that stopped when Frohl entered a room. That speculation I stayed out of, for reasons that were partly mine to keep, and partly that none of it was my business. Watched Frohl. Because Frohl was the loudest and most abrasive and most openly miserable person in the group, which meant Frohl was the most honest. There was nothing behind those arguments and complaints and sharp edges that my gift could catch as deception. Frohl said exactly what Frohl meant, at high volume, with minimal editing. What you saw was what you got. That, oddly, made Frohl one of the 3 people I trusted without reservation in the first 2 weeks. The others were Canoe and Dolph. The first accident happened on day 9. Ganga, full name Ganagas Gaganos, which was more than most of us used on a day-to-day basis, was a tall savant with the angular features common to his region, a voice like gravel dragged across hull plate, and a systematic dislike of me that he expressed with the passive precision of someone who has been trained to be rude without being documentably rude. He did not like my gift. He did not like my origins. He did not like the fact that I had been admitted to the same program as people whose families had been part of the Stellar Alliance since its founding. He made these feelings known in the way that certain people from certain planetary traditions make feelings known. Not by saying so directly, but by the quality of his silences when I spoke. By the small administrative decisions that consistently created inconveniences specifically for me. By the way he positioned himself in group discussions to physically interpose himself between my contributions and the center of Batseska's attention. I was familiar enough with the behavior not to take it personally. That is not to say it was pleasant. It was not pleasant, but I had grown up in a creche on a colony world as the child of no one in particular, with a gift that made me useful and strange in equal measure. And I had learned early that certain categories of dislike were structural rather than personal. That Ganga did not dislike me as an individual, particularly, but as a representative of a type, and that arguing with that kind of dislike was like arguing with the weather. On day 9, Ganga reached past a conduit panel in the engineering bay and took several thousand volts through his arm. He survived, barely. Chaco worked on him for 4 hours, while the rest of us stood in the corridor outside the medical bay and did not say the things we were thinking. Because the things we were thinking were the same things, and saying them would require us to acknowledge what the accident implied. His arm was damaged badly. The burn ran from his wrist to his shoulder, deep enough that Chaco had to manage it hour by hour. And when she finally pronounced him stable and the nerve damage assessed, the prognosis was that the sensation in 2 of his fingers was going to be unreliable for the rest of the exam, and possibly beyond it. The panel that had shocked him showed no fault in the subsequent diagnostic that New ran. The circuit had been altered not long ago. The alteration was skilled enough that you had to know what you were looking for to find it. And Knu found it only because Knu had already memorized the correct configuration. Someone had booby-trapped a panel in the engineering bay. Batseska called a meeting that evening. He was precise and unhurried in his phrasing, which I had come to understand was his version of being very, very angry. He laid out the logic in the measured cadences of someone who has been trained to think in front of an audience. The 11th person, whoever they were, had sabotaged the panel. The motive was unclear. The intended target was unclear. Ganga had reached for that panel, but any of us might have. The identity was what it had been since day 1. Impossible to determine by any method we had available. He looked at me when he said the last part. Everyone looked at me. I had been expecting it since before the meeting started. I am the esper. I am the one who had spent 9 days quietly observing everyone at the table. I am the one who had come aboard with no planetary connections, no allies in the group, no family to answer to, no one who would vouch for me, except the Academy records that said I belonged there. And Academy records, as we had already established, could apparently be circumvented. I am also a Terran and an orphan, and carrying a gift that some planetary traditions have historically treated as a reason for caution. Tell us what you know, Batseska said. I know that everyone at this table believes they are telling the truth, I said. That is all my gift tells me. It does not tell me who the 11th person is. It tells me that no one here is actively deceiving me about their identity in this moment. Sheened. That could mean the 11th person doesn't know they're the 11th person. Could mean they have stronger mental discipline than my gift can penetrate. Either way, I can't give you what you're looking for. Convenient, said Doricas. He said it quietly and without heat, which was worse. Inconvenient, actually, I said. If I could identify them, we would have had that conversation on day 1. The meeting resolved nothing, which was the honest outcome. We increased the watch rotation. We assigned buddy pairs for all engineering access. We documented every movement through the maintenance logs. We ate and slept and kept the ship running, and said things in pairs that we did not say to the group. I went to sleep that night with the awareness that the most probable outcome of the next 44 days was that someone would try to hurt one of us again, and that suspicion had already made its preliminary decision. The Esperanza began to move on day 14, not much at first. Drift so subtle that Dolph only caught it because he ran positional checks every 6 hours without exception. the obsessive regularity of a man who had grown up on ships and trusted nothing that did not have a recent timestamp on it. The black planet below was no longer quite as far below. We were descending into an orbit that had not been in our examination parameters. Slow and steady, with the calm inevitability of something that had been in progress longer than we had been paying attention. New found the cause on day 15. The conductor vines, organisms that had colonized the Esperanza's engine room at some point during her long dormancy. Biological masses, greenish-black and fibrous, that had grown into the electrical systems with the absolute indifference of life, finding a warm place to root and making itself at home, without reference to any prior plans for the space. They were active, growing visibly between one watch cycle and the next, drawing power from the ship's secondary grid in a pattern that New mapped with careful attention, and that fed, as far as he could trace it, into the drive systems. Not to power them, but to direct their minimal residual capacity in a specific direction, cut them back. They grew again in different configurations, routing around the cuts. On day 17, Dolph ran his recalculation, and the numbers landed differently than any of us wanted. The Esperanza was not falling toward the dead world below. She was rising, slowly, on a long arc that would have been elegant, if it were not also potentially lethal, toward the blue sun that had been invisible behind the black planet when we boarded. A sun that, at our current drift rate, we would approach to within a range that the ship's heat specifications did not make comfortable reading about. In approximately 14 days, temperature aboard the ship began to rise on day 20. Not quickly, not in the sudden alarming way that demands immediate action and gives you the adrenaline to take it. A degree at a time, distributed across days, the kind of change that the body adjusts to without fully registering, until you notice you are sleeping on top of your blanket instead of under it. Until you notice that the air in the corridors carries a dry warmth that wasn't there a week ago. Until you notice that New, whose species runs considerably cooler than humanoid standard, has begun to move with a slight deliberateness that I had come to recognize as the behavior of a creature managing heat load and not finding it comfortable. We tried to restore course correction. Dolph and Knu worked in the engineering section for 2 days straight, running on short sleep and the particular focused energy of people who understand what happens if they fail. They recovered partial thrust, enough to slow the drift significantly, enough to push the timeline back from 14 days to something closer to 3 weeks, but not enough to reverse the arc entirely. The conductor vines, trimmed back in the main engine compartment, had spread through secondary routing channels that fed the corrective maneuvering systems, and cutting them out of those channels, without taking down the power grid, required work that was careful and slow, and produced incremental results. Cut what we could. The drift slowed. The temperature continued rising. We reorganized the living spaces, moving sleep rotations to the lower decks where the heat was a degree or two less. We adjusted the maintenance schedules to avoid the hottest parts of the ship during the hottest parts of the ship's artificial day. We drank more water and worked shorter shifts in engineering and said less to each other, not from hostility, but from the conservation of energy that heat enforces on bodies that are working hard. On day 22, Totoni developed a fever, a personal one, the specific flush and slow diminishment of someone falling ill, distinct from the ambient heat, which Chaco identified within 6 hours and pronounced with the careful phrasing of a person who has trained herself to give bad news precisely rather than gently. Dell's spotted fever, a hemorrhagic virus endemic to a particular orbital belt through which the Esperanza had been drifting on her long arc. The ship had been dormant in proximity to that belt for years. The pathogen had found its way into the air cycling system at some point. Probably recently, probably linked to our arrival, and the reactivation of the cycling hardware, which had apparently not been fully decontaminated before the examination began. Chaco was calm about it. She was one of those medical people whose training has given them the specific capacity to be calm about things that terrify everyone else. Not because they feel less, but because the feeling and the function have been separated by years of practice. She laid out the progression. Flu-like onset, 4 to 6 days. Fever escalating to peak severity around day 8 to 10. Internal bleeding risk at peak. Manageable with intervention, dangerous without it. Fatality rate approximately 1 in 4 in untreated adults of standard humanoid metabolism, lower with the right treatment protocol. She had the equipment to synthesize a partial treatment from the ship's medical stores. She would work on a full vaccine. Quarantine protocols were straightforward, and she had already implemented them. What she did not say, and what the rest of us understood without it being said, was that 3 weeks in a hot ship with a compromised air system and an active viral pathogen was going to produce more than one case. Totoni was first. There would be others. There were others. By day 26, we had 3 confirmed cases and 2 people running borderline temperatures. The ship was at 38 degrees in the upper decks by midday, cooling slightly at night, but not enough. Working in engineering required fluid replacement and rest cycles that cut into shift efficiency. We were all sleeping less and moving through the ship with the careful conservation of people, managing a budget of energy that was not replenishing as fast as it was being spent. The group fractured properly on day 26. It started in the mess hall during the evening meal, which was when most of the damage of the examination got done. The day's work completed, the watch rotations not yet started. Nothing constructive left to do with the remaining hours, except sit with each other in the heat and the uncertainty. Glenn had been quiet all day in the way that certain people are quiet when they are building to something. What he said was methodical. He laid it out in the measured cadence of someone who has been working on an argument in private for several days and has finally decided the situation demands it be spoken. The only person aboard with a coherent reason to want the examination to fail, to want us sick, to want the group fracturing, to want someone to suppress the emergency locator, was the one who had been watching from day one and contributing nothing decisive. The one with no planetary allies, no family, no one who would answer for him if things went wrong. The one whose gift was supposedly diagnostic, but had produced nothing useful in 26 days when it was the most relevant tool available. The one documented in the maintenance log near the engineering bay on the evening ganga was electrocuted. He used a word at the end. A word that some worlds use for people whose mental gifts make them structurally dangerous rather than useful. I had heard it once before when I was young. I was not prepared for the specific weight of it in that room, in that heat, with fever cases in the medical bay down the corridor. I did not respond. The fear in that room was real and did not need my argument. What I could do was sit very still and breathe through it, and give them nothing that looked like guilt. But Seska said, very quietly, that accusations without evidentiary foundation were not operational decisions, and that we would not be making operational decisions on that basis. He said it once. In the register he used rarely enough that it carried weight. Glenn sat down. The meal ended. We went to our stations. Bacheska found me in the navigation bay at 0130. He sat across the charts from me in the chair Dolph usually occupied, and he did not say anything for a moment. The navigation board cast its steady light between us. I want to be honest with you, he said. Do not know if you are the 11th person. I cannot rule it out. I know, I said. I cannot rule it out either. He looked at me. Explain that. My gift detects deception in other people. It cannot be turned inward. I went into those pods with 9 names on a list. I woke up believing I was who I have always believed I was. If someone with stronger abilities than mine had adjusted that certainty, given me a constructed identity that would hold up under my own internal checking, I would have no access to the truth of it. It was the first time I had said it to anyone. The vertigo of not knowing whether the ground you stand on is real. I had been carrying it since the first week, a low, continuous note beneath everything. Teska was quiet for a long time. And yet, you have been acting as though you are who you say you are. I have no alternative, I said. If I am not who I believe I am, I have no access to that truth. I can only act from what I have. He thought about it with the careful attention of a man who does not waste his thinking. Think you are who you say you are, he said finally. You were the saboteur, and had the gifts to hide it this long, you would have been considerably more effective operationally. The accidents have stopped. Ganga's incident targeted the person most hostile to you, which is either transparent misdirection or evidence that whoever did it was not working on your behalf. He paused. That is meant as a form of confidence. I'll take it, I said. And Frol had been ill for 2 days before telling anyone. I found this out not through my gift, but through the old-fashioned method of being awake at 0300 for reasons common to everyone who drinks enough water to stay functional in 40-degree heat. Frol was standing at the water reclamation panel at the end of the lower corridor, and the light there was bad, but not so bad that I couldn't see that Frol was holding the wall with one hand and looking at it with the fixed attention of someone concentrating very hard on a simple task because it has become complicated. Fine, Frol said before I had said anything. I didn't ask yet, I said. You were going to. I was. I walked to the panel and filled my cup and filled another one and handed it over. Frol took it and drank with the careful deliberateness of someone managing nausea. The temperature under my palm, when I briefly rested it on the wall near Frol's hand, was wrong. How long? 2 days, Frol said. You need to tell Chaco. I know that, Frol said. Fury in it was familiar, and entirely, I thought, directed inward rather than at me. Fury of someone who has been trying very hard not to need something, and has run out of the capacity to maintain that not needing. I walked Frol to the medical bay. I sat in the corridor outside while Chaco ran her assessment. And when the door opened and Chaco looked at me with the expression she had for situations that required additional thought, I understood. The vaccine, when it was ready, would not work on Frol. Chaco reported this to the group on day 29, with the careful precision of someone who has thought through the implications of every word before speaking them. Frol's body chemistry was different from the other candidates in ways that the vaccine's current formulation did not accommodate. She had reformulated twice already. She would continue. The fever's progression in Frol was following a curve that was currently manageable, and would, if she could not find the right formulation, become less so. The timeline was approximately 10 days before the situation became critical. Frol said nothing during this report, sat at the end of the mess hall table with arms crossed and jaw set, and eyes on the middle distance. The expression of someone who has already done the arithmetic and found the answer unacceptable and is now deciding what to do with that information. I understood the arithmetic. The emergency locator was a large toggle switch on the bridge, safeguarded against accidental activation by 2 sequential confirmations. Pressing it broadcast a distress signal on the Academy's emergency channel. The rescue ship would arrive within 48 hours. Everyone aboard would be evacuated and treated. The exam would be voided. All would fail. There was no partial credit, no individual extraction. The rules of the examination, stated in the first briefing and on every form we had signed, were without ambiguity. The emergency locator ended the exam for everyone. Frol's planet of origin had a particular arrangement for candidates who failed. The arrangement was not punitive in the institutional sense. It was simply the structure of Frol's homeworld, the path that was prepared and waiting for anyone who could not find their way out of it. A marriage, a household, permanent assignment of a specific kind of life that Frol had, by everything I understood from 3 weeks of watching, spent the entirety of conscious memory working to make impossible. The Academy was not just the Academy for Frol, it was the door. Failing meant the door closed. Closed permanently, in ways that the culture of Vini made very difficult to contest. We argued about it in the mess hall on day 30. Not argued. Debated is not right either. We assembled ourselves and said things that were true, and things that were logical, and things that were meant to be kind. And Frol sat at the end of the table, with a fever of 102 degrees and kept repeating, with steadily diminishing volume but absolutely undiminished firmness, the word no. Die, Chaco said. She had used the word carefully and several times. I know, Frol said. We would all fail, Amazon said. I know. We could retake it, Dolph said, with the specific careful gentleness of a peacemaker reaching for the only handle he could find. In 3 years, all of us together, if that's what it takes. I won't make you do that, Frol said. Don't use it as a reason. It isn't your choice to make, and it isn't a gift I can accept. Then let it be my choice, Beska said. He had been quiet for most of the conversation, which meant he had been thinking carefully. I am willing to fail this examination. I am willing to retake it in 3 years. I am saying this as a fact about what I am willing to do, not as a claim on your decision. But I want you to know it is not only your failure that is on the table. Frohl looked at him. Something passed through that expression. Not softened, exactly. More like the face of someone who has been given information they did not expect and are integrating it without letting it change the bottom line. No, Frohl said. The temperature at the ship's equatorial deck had reached 41 degrees Celsius. We were approaching peak proximity to the blue sun. Still alive because the Esperanza's heat shielding was considerably more robust than anything her age, and listed specifications suggested it should be. One more mystery of the old ship to add to the accumulating file. We were 23 days from the end of the examination. 23 days in which Frohl's body was losing ground to a fever that Chaco's third formulation had failed to stop. And the rest of us were working double maintenance shifts in heat that left us gray-faced and slow, and starting to show the hollowness of people who have been in genuine danger for long enough that the adrenaline has burned through its reserves, and what remains is just endurance. Day 31. At 0100, I went to the Esperanza's library. She had one. A genuine archive built into her secondary systems, accessible from a terminal on the lower deck that nobody used much, because the interface was several generations out of date. And the catalog followed an organizational logic that required patience and a tolerance for dead ends to navigate. I had used it twice before, during the long hours of night watch, when the ship's sound seemed louder and the corridors felt tighter. I knew roughly the shape of what was in it. I'd been sitting with a thought for 48 hours, and the thought would not leave me alone. And sitting with it without acting on it had become more uncomfortable than the alternative. The Esperanza had history. We had all felt it since the first day. The way she responded, the way she ran, the specific character of her systems and corridors, and the faint resistance in her panels. These were not the qualities of a ship that had sat empty and dormant for its entire existence. She had been somewhere and done something. And the record of that was somewhere in her. I was looking for her medical history. The search took 3 hours. The records were fragmented in the way of documents that have passed through multiple administrations, each with its own reason to clarify and reorganize, and in the process obscure what had been there before. Whole sections were redacted with the bureaucratic consistency of files, scrubbed down to their structural bones. The underlying data was intact in the old compressed formats, stored in the layers beneath the readable surface, because the people who had done the redacting had deleted the display layers and left the source files in place. Either they had not known the source files existed, or they had decided no one would look. I looked. The Esperanza had not always been a training vessel. In an earlier operational period, she had been active in the kind of work that leaves specific records in medical systems. She had serviced outbreak zones, carried medical teams into quarantine situations, been on the receiving end of more than one emergency evacuation. She had been quarantined 3 times herself. She had a service record, buried in a maintenance log from 31 years prior, that documented a Dell-spotted fever outbreak among her own crew. Crew that had survived. A crew whose blood chemistry, if any record of it existed in the ship's medical archives, would give Chaco something entirely different to work from. Immune profiles built from real infection and real recovery, from bodies that had gone through the disease and come out the other side, not from vaccine logic, but from the thing the vaccine is trying to approximate. Blood work from that outbreak was not in the main library. A cross-reference in the quarantine log pointed to a research designation. Lower medical storage, compartment 7, sealed under a medical authority stamp from the period of the outbreak. Our initial inventory had logged that compartment as empty. I went there. The compartment was not empty. It held a cryogenic sample container, gray-sided, smaller than I expected, sealed with a biometric lock that accepted my Academy authorization codes after a 3-second consideration that felt longer than it was. Inside, 16 vials in a foam rack, labeled in a medical notation system that predated the current Academy's formatting by at least 30 years. Frozen solid, intact. The labels were abbreviated but readable, if you knew the convention. And I had found the convention in the archive an hour earlier. I brought the container to Chaco at 0400. She was awake. She had been sleeping 4 hours out of every 12 for 2 weeks, running the overnight medical check on the fever cases, and then going back to reformulate, and going back to check, and going back to reformulate. Shh. She opened the container with the deliberate hands of a person handling something that might be significant and might be nothing, and does not want to compromise it in the handling. She looked at the vials. She looked at the labels. She looked at me. "Where did you find this?" she said quietly. I told her. The archive search, the cross-reference, the compartment, the biometric lock, the contents. She listened with the particular focused stillness of someone building a picture. "This is extraordinary," she said. "Will it work?" I said. She picked up one of the vials and held it up to the light, tilting it slightly, examining it the way you examine something when you want to understand it before you commit to an opinion. "No yet," she said. "Give me 6 hours." I left her to it. I went back to my bunk and lay in the heat with my eyes open and thought about the Esperanza's history, about the ship we had been living on for 30 days, what she had done and what she had carried and what she might have been designed, in some deep structural sense, to carry. I thought about the conductor vines and the drift and the way the shield specifications had turned out to exceed the documentation. I thought about the feeling I sometimes had in empty corridors, moving through the ship in the dark, of a presence that was patient and deliberate and not hostile. I did not sleep. I was not particularly surprised by this. At noon on day 32, Chaco administered a vaccine derived from 31-year-old frozen serum samples to Frol Baracheri Frol, who was lying on the medical bay's narrow cot, running a fever of 104 degrees, and had stopped arguing about things only because arguing requires energy that the body was currently assigning to other priorities. The rest of us stayed within the area of the medical bay for the next 4 hours, running maintenance tasks in the adjacent sections, checking the same systems twice, finding reasons to pass the medical bay door. No one said what they were doing. Everyone understood what they were doing. By evening, the fever had not broken. By midnight, it was 103 and still falling. Cho 400. Chaco updated the common board. 101.4, still falling. The serum was working. Day 33, Frol sat up, ate a full ration, and told Chaco that the food synthesizer's protein to carbohydrate ratio remained below therapeutic standard for recovery patients, and that something should be done about it. Chaco and I looked at each other across the medical bay. "The protein balance has been a known issue since day 4, Chaco said, not unkindly. "Then it should have been addressed by day 5, Frol said. "You're right," Chaco said. "Look at the synthesizer settings again." Frol looked slightly mollified. "Then, thank you, both of you." Quietly, in the tone of someone who says this rarely and means it entirely when they do. Then Frol asked for a second ration, which Chaco provided, and which Frol ate with the focused efficiency of a body making up for lost time. The last 20 days of the examination were not easy. The ship remained hot until day 36, when the drift's peak proximity had been fully passed, and the Esperanza began the long, slow arc back to cooler space. And the temperature in the upper decks dropped to something that merely required discipline rather than management. We were all thinner and more tired than we had been on day 1. The question of the 11th person sat in the background of every group meeting, and every shared oatmeal, unresolved, acknowledged occasionally by a careful reference and then set aside again. The accidents had stopped after day 9. The conductor lines had retreated entirely by day 40. The engineering section clear. For the first time since we had boarded, as if they had completed whatever they were doing, and were no longer interested in the ship's systems. The drift arc, as Dolph recalculated it on day 38, was returning the Esperanza to the original examination coordinates with a precision that implied something purposeful about the whole trajectory. Something that none of us was in a position to fully explain. We filed reports. We maintained the ship. We made meals in the mess hall and sat around the long bolted table in varying configurations and talked about things that were not the examination, about home, about what came after, about the specific variety of future that each of us was trying to reach. These conversations had a different quality than the ones we had been having for the first 3 weeks. Performance in them, less maneuvering. The heat and the fever, and the long accumulation of difficult days had burned off the particular layer of social presentation that people maintain when they are trying to be seen in a certain way. And what was left was mostly just people, being real with each other in the limited time available. I learned, in those last 20 days, that Petseska was afraid of the specific kind of failure that no one else could see. Not the public to defeat, but the private one, the internal moment of knowing you made the wrong call, and that someone else paid for it. That this was the fear that had been running under the command instinct the whole time. The thing that made his authority careful as well as natural. I told him that was probably a better engine for command than the alternative. He thought about that for 2 days, and then told me I was probably right, which cost him something, and was therefore worth more. I learned that Canoe's calm was not indifference but precision. That Canoe perceived the emotional weather of a situation as clearly as any of us, and simply operated at a different processing speed, which meant that what looked like detachment was actually comprehensive awareness that had not yet finished being processed into words. This explained a great deal about certain moments earlier in the examination. I learned that Amazon had a younger sibling at home who wanted to follow her into the academy, and that the weight of being the example for that ambition was part of what had kept her working double shifts in the heat without complaint. Not entirely altruistic, but not nothing either. On day 52, I was sitting in the navigation bay, watching the stars that were now familiar after 52 days of looking at them, running the positional calculations that Dolph had taught me early in the examination as a way to give the night watch something useful to do. The bay was quiet. The rest of the ship was in its night cycle, most of the group asleep or nearly so. I felt as something between temperature and sound, the same register my gift uses for deception, but carrying none of the dissonance that deception creates. Clear instead, clean. A presence in the space that the room provided no visible source for. Deliberate and gentle. The way a hand placed on a shoulder is deliberate and gentle, when the person placing it knows exactly what they're doing. Turned around. The navigation bay was empty, but the presence stayed for a moment longer, and in that staying was something I can only describe now, years later, and with the benefit of knowing what it was, as a communication. Not words. An impression. The way you can sometimes understand what someone means without any of it being said. An acknowledgement. A recognition. Something that said, in the register that is beyond language, I was here. I was watching. You did well. Then it was gone. On day 53 at 0800 ship time, the examination ended. The Academy's timer broadcast the official notification through the ship's common system in the neutral voice of a pre-recorded message that had delivered this moment to thousands of groups before ours, and would deliver it to thousands after. We assembled in the docking bay, all 10 of us, in the particular condition of people who have been in genuine difficulty for a long time, and are not yet sure it is over. The rescue ship arrived at 1000. The Academy proctor came aboard first. A small man, middle-aged, with the economical movement of someone who does not perform their authority, because it has long since become simply what they are. He walked the line of us, without hurry, stopping briefly in front of each candidate, making no assessments out loud. When he reached me, he stopped longer. "Condidiant Lane," he said. "Sir," I said. "The ship's access logs show a library terminal session at 0115 on day 31, he said. "Lower deck, 3 hours and 12 minutes. Storage 7 opened at 0427. "Yes, sir, walk me through it." I walked him through it. The reasoning that had led me to the archive, the cross-reference to the quarantine records, the inference associated the sample container, the retrieval, Chaco's work. I gave him the sequence without embellishment, in the factual cadence of a report, what I knew, how I knew it, what I concluded, what I did. See, he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "The sample container was placed in compartment 4 days before your group boarded the Esperanza." I looked at him. The materials inside were functional. Candidate Frohl's recovery is evidence of that. But they were not from the historical outbreak I presume you inferred. The archive entries you followed were constructed specifically for this cohort. The path to that compartment was laid for someone who would look for it. In the navigation bay, the empty room, presence with steadier eyes than mine. The 11th person, I said. The 11th person, he confirmed. An academy instructor. An esper, significantly more capable than your current level. Assigned to every cohort's final examination as an unannounced observer. Someone whose role is to monitor the group's dynamics from within, to introduce controlled variables, and to intervene if the examination produces outcomes that exceed the recoverable range. The accident on day 9, I said. The conductor vines. The controlled, he said. The drift was designed to test crisis management under heat stress and resource scarcity. Fever exposure was real, but within parameters we had calculated as recoverable for your specific candidate profiles. He paused, and the pause had the quality of precision rather than hesitation. Contritiant Froll's biology introduced a variable that our profiles had not fully accounted for. The instructor made a judgment call. They assessed that the candidate most likely to find the alternative solution, given sufficient information and sufficient motivation, was you. I thought about Froll in the medical bay, fever coming down degree by degree through the night. Was Froll actually in danger? I said. Yes, he said without softening it. The standard recovery protocol would not have been sufficient. We were within the window of intervention when the serum was found and administered. He looked at me with the steady attention of someone recording something accurately. The instructor was correct in their assessment of you. I stood with that for a moment. 53 days of questioning whether I was who I believed I was, whether my sense of my own identity was something that could have been adjusted, whether the ground I stood on was solid. And the whole time, somewhere in the spaces between the people I could see, someone with clearer eyes had been watching and had decided I was worth betting on. The feeling was not simple. Attitude was in it, and a kind of anger at not having been told, and underneath both of those something that was closer to steadiness than either. We all passed, I said. You alls, he said. He moved on. Froll was the last one, aboard the transfer, walking with the slightly measured gait of someone whose legs have recently been reminded they have a job to do. And I fell into step alongside without making a decision to do it. We went through the ship in silence, through the lower corridor where the water panel was, through the section near the medical bay where the light had always been slightly better than elsewhere, through the docking bay where we had woken up 53 days ago and found ourselves 11 instead of 10. Froll stopped at the top of the transfer ramp and looked back at the Esperanza's interior. The docking bay. The floor plates scuffed from 53 days of boots and maintenance equipment. The lighting that had always been functional if not warm. The walls that had been cold when we arrived, and then hot and were now simply themselves again. I'm going to study medicine, Froll said. Chaco said she'd sponsor my application to the medical program. That's a good fit, I said. I know it is, Froll said. The certainty in it was pure Froll. The statement of the obvious delivered as though the obvious requires delivery. Then, more quietly, you went looking at 0100 when you didn't know if there was anything to find. I didn't have a better option, I said. That is what knowing looks like, Froll said. When the situation is bad enough, we went aboard the transfer. The Esperanza stayed where she was, at the end of that dock, the same way she had been waiting when we arrived. Patient. Old. The kind of old that is not deterioration but accumulation. Years and crews and outbreaks and drifts and instructor observers and cadets, at a time for however long she had been doing this work, adding each experience to whatever she was. I watched her through the transfer port until she was small enough to lose against the stars. I don't know what the point of an examination like that is supposed to be. Not entirely. They tell you it tests crisis management and resource allocation and leadership under stress, and it does all of those things, and none of those descriptions are wrong, and none of them are quite enough. I think the truth of it is simpler and harder to put in documentation. People in the dark with real danger and real stakes, and a very long time to find out what they are. The difficulty is the instrument. The 53 days are the measurement. What they measure, I have thought about for years. I think what they measure is what you do when the easy things are gone. When the options are all difficult and the right choice is not obvious, and the cost of being wrong is someone else's welfare. When the choice between holding the line and taking the easy exit is entirely yours to make. in a corridor at Era 100 with no one watching and no record being kept. You find out in those moments that you were carrying more than you knew. The transfer docked at the Academy station at 1400. We walked off together,